build up. But when you start going from 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 to 4,000, that's what we're seeing happen in places like Italy. We're beginning to see it in some ways up in Seattle. It's what happened in China. And, when people are confronted with that, suddenly this low-risk phenomena that everybody talks about isn't so low anymore. And that's what we need to prepare people for.
Now, what can be done? Like, what can the average person do? I see people walking around with masks on, wearing gloves. Is that nonsense?
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
First of all, let's step back. The primary mechanism for transmission is just the respiratory route. It's just breathing. In studies in Germany, which just have been published literally in the last 24 hours, they actually followed a group of people who had been exposed to somebody in an automobile manufacturing plant. And then they had 9 people that, with this exposure, he said, if you have any symptoms at all, contact us. We want to follow up. And they all agreed. Well, they got infected. And so in the very first hours, just feeling bad, sore throat, they went in and sampled their throats, their saliva, their nose for virus. They did blood, they did stool, they did urine. And they found that at that very moment, when they first got sick, they had incredibly high levels of virus, sometimes 10,000 times that we saw with SARS, in their throats, meaning they were infectious at that point already, and they hadn't even had symptoms yet of really any nature. They weren't coughing yet.
Wow.
And that's where we're concerned, because that's the kind of transmission. It's, I always have said, trying to stop influenza virus transmission like trying to stop the wind. We've never had anything successfully do that other than vaccine, and we don't have a vaccine here. So what's happening is that people in public spaces are getting infected. And the way you need to address that is, unfortunately, if you're older, over 55, you have some underlying health problems, which unfortunately a lot of Americans do. We have obesity. Then right now you don't want to be in large public spaces and trying to potentially get infected. So you can take care of that part. As far as what can public health do, we can talk about this. We're not going to have a vaccine anytime soon. That's happy talk. We can close schools. One of the big challenges we have right now, if we close schools, what do we accomplish? In influenza virus, when we close schools during outbreaks, because it turns out kids get infected in school and they're like little virus reactors. They come home and they transmit it to mom and dad and brothers and sisters. And so we close schools sometimes. Christmas breaks are always great for kind of putting the dampening effect on flu. In this case, kids are not getting sick very often at all, which is one of the really good news features of this disease. In China, only 2.1% of the cases are under 19 years of age.
And why is that?
We don't completely know. And I'm going to come to that in a second, because they're getting infected, it turns out. One study showed that they still get infected with the virus, but they don't get sick. And we have that happen. There's a disease called infectious hepatitis A, where we have outbreaks in daycares. And the way we know we have an outbreak is because it's transmitted through the stool, fecal-oral, is mom and dad and the daycare providers all get sick. And the kids, those symptoms, we go in and test the kids, are all positive. So some diseases will manifest primarily when you're an adult, but not as a child. This one appears to be the same. So do we close schools or not, if we're not really spreading the disease? Because it turns out that if we close schools, a recent study done showed that 38% of nurses today in this country who are working in the medical care area have kids in school. And if suddenly we're closing schools for 2 or 3 months, who's going to take care of those kids? 1/4 of the American population has no sick leave. If we close schools, they don't get paid if they have to stay home. So when you ask what can we do, we have to really be thoughtful about what we do. Are we doing more harm than good by closing schools, for example, even though everybody will say, we got to do everything we can? Or do we just tell people, it's going to be limiting your contact as much as you can, and that's really about what we can do.
And limiting the contact, is that really going to help?
It does, because it's like putting rods in a reaction. If you don't have as much close contact, you can not transmit as much. If I'm sitting in a room with 100 people and we're kind of sharing air, the transmission is remarkable. Right here off the coast of California, you've got your cruise ship. Cruise ships are notorious for recirculating air inside the inner cabins. We've had a number of outbreaks.
That's why they're having these outbreaks on cruise ships?
And then you leave them on there. I think the cruelest human experiment we've done in a long time with humans is leave them on these ships. Get them off right away.
Should they get them off right away?
Oh, absolutely.
And what should they do with them?
Well, they can put them in quarantines of some kind if they want and follow up on them. But you're guaranteed they're all going to keep getting infected day after day.
It seems like we're not really prepared for something like this, although the CDC's been telling us for a long time that we should be.
We are not prepared at all in the sense. I wrote the book, Deadliest Enemies, that was published in 2017.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Go get it.
No.
And panic.
In chapter 13, the title of the chapter was SARS and MERS, a harbinger of things to come. We predicted this. And then I wrote a chapter on there what a flu pandemic would look like if it emerged in China. And if you read it, it's exactly what's happened. The supply chains went down, China locked down the country, it spread to other countries, people all pointed fingers. And, it's the kind of thing where we hear it, but we don't get prepared. 5 years ago, I gave a talk at the Mayo Clinic. First time I talked about this, I talked many times afterwards, and I showed a slide of Puerto Rico, a picture of Puerto Rico, and then I showed the map, and then I showed a picture of a building in Puerto Rico, a nondescript building, and I said, this is our next big disaster. Turns out that 85% of all the world's production of IV bags, with saline that we need desperately, were made in these plants in Puerto Rico. And all we needed was one Category 5 hurricane to come through and take it out. Maria came through a year and a half ago, and the world went into a major crisis with a shortage of IV bags. Now, that was so obvious that was going to happen, and yet we don't prepare.
That's so foolish.
I know, I agree. And that's what, hopefully this is a wake-up call. The business community, I hopefully will wake up. One of the other things we're doing right now, Joe, this is really, one of the things that has me most concerned about this whole situation is our group has been studying for the last year and a half with support from the Walton Family Foundation, looking at critical drug shortages. It turns out that we identified 153 drugs in this country that people need right now or they die. I mean, it's on the crash card, it's acute critical drugs. 100% of them are generic. All of them basically are made offshore of the United States. And a large part of them are made in China and India. And at this point, we have shortages anyway every day, just before this crisis happened. Now these supply chains have gone down. Our group is actively helping the United States government try to figure out where they're going to get these drugs. Now, just think of this. If I came to you and said the Defense Department was going to outsource all its munitions production to China, you'd look at me and say, come on. You know what? The U.S. Defense Department has no more access to these drugs than anybody else. They are beholden to China for these drugs. 690,000 Americans have end-stage renal disease right now. Most of their primary drugs are coming from China. And now with the shutdown, and what's happening with this, and this is what I talked about in the book, why I was so concerned, because we are at risk. So even this situation as it unfolds, it's not just about what the virus does to you, it's about what the entire system is rigged up to be, and what this virus does once it gets into it.
Jesus. You're making me nervous.
Well, but that's before we get done here. We're going to talk about what we can do to get people not nervous, because this is
it's too late.
No. What I mean is we're going to bring you around to take. It's my job is not to scare you out of your wits; it's to scare you into your wits.
Hey, you can't do that.
Quiet, present. Full speed ahead for Paris.
Albert, to victory!
Why is this so important to you?
Because there is no bigger laugh than seeing the good guys get it! Get it?
Got it.
Good! You with all your arms! And under my direction, you will be the world's greatest tickler!
Good work, Wheezy. Now, let's get up there and take our ship back. Ship back, ship back!
Hey, look!
What's going on here?
Help! Help, Captain!
Get us down!
Untie him, Wheezy.
Get down below, you filthy brute! I'll shoot!
Can't we let bygones be bygones?
See, monster!
Action! Into the breach, my friend!
what fate awaits us. Gotcha.
Fire 2! Fire 3! Fire 4! Fire 5! Fire 6! 7! 8! And fire him! Okay, okay. Ready? Aim! Tickle! This is the funniest thing ever. Oh, look, I'm getting bigger. I'm getting bigger.
You see, Beckett? Marcella told us never to leave the playroom.
I have made a mess of everything. What a blow!
Below! Below!
Don't give up.
What did you say? Blow! Up! Blow! Up! Blow up! Oh, get the little rag down there. Say, little raggedy Ann. Yeah. Oh, now tickle her, dummy, tickle her. Yeah, yeah. Tickle her.